thank you all for joining us today, and we are absolutely thrilled to have Anders Sandberg with us. Anders has been a friend to the Bitesize over the years and was in fact part of our very first programme back in 2021, where he gave a talk on deepfakes, which he's going to do again today. And I think those of you who remember that talk from 2021 will see how it's progressed during those 3 years. Anders, are you happy to take it from there?
Oh, yeah, totally happy. Thank you so
Wonderful,
much
thank you.
for having me. And as you can probably guess, that is a deep fake because Putin is not left-handed, probably. So I'm Anders Sandberg. I'm a lapsed computational neuroscientist, one of those academics who can't really keep to one topic. So I end up drifting between a lot of different domains, but I'm quite interested in ethics. I've been working and associated with the Uehiro Center for a long time. Right now, my formal affiliation is just the Mimer Center for Long-Term Future Studies at the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. But I'm around Oxford and do a little bit of everything. Okay, so what is deepfakes and how do you make them? So this is actually related to research I used to do, not directly, but as a computational neuroscientist, I'm interested in, can we make computers do things like how the brain does it? And can we use that to make better computer systems, or can we use it to understand the brain? And a typical problem is image recognition. You show a picture to the computer, and now you want it to tell you, is that a car, or is it a cat, or is it Albert Einstein? And one method of doing that is to divide it up, just like the brain does, into small units, neurons. These simulated neurons are much simpler than the actual biological neurons we got in our heads, but they are doing a roughly similar job. They take inputs from one side, weigh them together in some way, and then produce an output. And these are just simple signals. The trick is that you have a lot of them in different layers arranged in various ways. And then you update these connections, you train the network, you show it a lot of pictures of cars, and it gives some output saying that it's an airplane or that it's Albert Einstein. That's wrong, so you correct them so it is a little bit better at saying car. And then you show them a picture of Einstein, correct for that. And then you keep on doing this for thousands, millions, billions of times. And eventually you end up with a classifier. This classifier is very interesting because it can recognize things, but the internal part, which we're totally going to ignore how they actually work because that's not important, do contain extra information that's quite interesting, because you can actually find that the early layers contain neurons that react to lines and edges and borders, which is very similar to what our brains actually do. In the primary visual cortex, where the signals from the eyes come in, you find neurons that also are sensitive to edges and borders. Then there are other parts of the brain that take those inputs and put them together and realize that's a headlight, that is an unruly lock of hair or something like that. So the deeper layers make more complicated composite things. Some of them are also noticing styles. And then people realize that we could actually rewire these networks to use them to do other fun stuff, including generate pictures. So you can take a neural network and have it extract a style from a picture. And then by putting it together in a slightly different way, add that style to the picture. So this is called style transfer. So you can take a photo, for example, of a scene in San Francisco, and then you take Van Gogh's Starry Night. That's the standard picture everybody in style transfer always uses. It's a visual cliche. And then you can get Van Gogh's picture of San Francisco skyscrapers. This is kind of amusing, and you can play around with this in various ways. But you can also start wondering, can I train networks to make entirely new pictures? And that turns out to be possible. You can actually kind of reverse them. You can tell them what you want to have, and then they generate a picture. You essentially run them backwards. So that might be useful, but most of these pictures don't look very good. So then people came up with something they called generative adversarial networks. They took two little networks. One network made pictures. The other, the critic, was trying to detect, is the picture I'm seeing something that was faked by another neural network, or is this a real photo? So you give them random actual photos or paintings, and then the critic is learning how to distinguish it. And of course, it's scoring the first network making the picture. So it's trying to get better at fooling the critic. And the critic is trying to get better at discerning the difference between real and neural. And then you keep them looping. And this turns out to be really good at making pictures that actually look like reality. So these pictures are from a site called thispersondoesnotexist.com, which by now has been up for a surprisingly long time. In the world of machine learning and artificial intelligence, a year is a decade. A lot of stuff has happened. Indeed, this whole idea about generative adversarial network is kind of obsolete these days. We have something called stable diffusion or diffusion models that is much more active. People have developed a lot more technology. But I'm not going to try to get into that because I'm just going to make a fool of myself and show that I'm not up to date. I studied this way too long ago. But the interesting thing about these photos is, of course, that they actually look quite plausible. It's very much generic photos because you have trained these networks on a lot of portraits of a lot of people. And what you then do is just let loose the system to generate more pictures and eventually get something that looks really good. And now, of course, you can do it with video too. So Chris Ume did a video a few years ago. Again, this is relatively old stuff, but he did a deepfake video where he was moving around and then had the neural networks replace him with Tom Cruise. And he gave a little mini lecture about that deepfakes are coming. This is kind of scary. We need to do something about it. It's worth noticing that Chris Ume, he's got a lot of skill. He's an expert on video editing. So back then it took a fair bit of effort. It's become much, much simpler since then. And that, of course, means that right now, a lot of people got very concerned. And there have been a lot of concern about this because the most obvious application that happens with any new technology is pornography. Okay, you can take a picture of somebody and you can make a fake celebrity pornography. Back in the early days, people had to use Photoshop to put a favorite actor or actress head on a nude picture. Now they can be seamlessly integrated, or you can actually put people in new poses, etc. You can see the obvious moral panic. A bit more sinister than just titillation is, of course, that this can be used for social and political harassment. Revenge porn is a problem already, but you can also, of course, now actually totally fake pornography of political enemies. And this has actually been used in political harassment, especially in countries where there are conservative social mores and then usually directed against female candidates. Another interesting case is, of course, that this is getting easier to do. So you have the parents trying to harass rivals in the cheerleading squad. And more recently, of course, you can do this not just for pictures, but for sound, including voices. So there have been fake robocalls from President Biden in New Hampshire urging voters not to show up in polls during the primary, saying that they should be saving their votes for November. Except, of course, this is not at all what the American president wanted the voters to do. It was actually a Republican political operator making these fake robocalls. And unfortunately for him, he was also found out and traced back, and then is now facing jail time and stiff fines. Now, the interesting part here is, of course, how this is this an ethical problem? And I think this is not a profound ethical problem. There is practically no moral system that approves of this kind of thing. The real problem is actually a practical. What do we do about it? But let's angle at looking at what are the ethical problems really going on here with deepfake. What is actually the deep problem? Again, just to keep a little bit on the fraud line, it's interesting to notice some cases that have shown up. So to the left, we have a maybe badly headlined case. It was not that an AI had a gun at the airport. It's a bit unclear who's doing what, but basically it seems like the athletic director who got fired got upset at the principal, so he made a few recordings where the principal sounded like he made racist and anti-Semitic comments, and that of course blew up, and the principal was put on leave while being investigated. And then people found out that, wait a minute, this was fake. And then that director tried to run away, and he was caught with a gun at the airport. So in this case, it looks like it ends well, at least for the principal, because, okay, he seems to be innocent of this accusation. It's kind of interesting to note how this could blow up, because we're living in a culture right now where if somebody is making a racist or racist seeming comment, you can easily be put on leave, and people react extremely strongly, extremely rapidly, without necessarily looking deeply into the evidence, because it's enough that it looks like this, especially in the framing of education and a school and a position of power, for people to react. The other case is perhaps even more worrisome. So it turned out that there was a Zoom meeting inside a financial firm where an employee were talking to the people he believed he knew. He believed he recognized these other people in the meeting, and the chief financial officer was ordering him to do a particular transaction, which moved $25 million to a bank account belonging to some of the fraudsters. This is, of course, much more disturbing, and indeed, voice deepfakes have become more and more common as a way of committing fraud. You can get a call, and it seems to be a loved one, and they're saying, "Oh no, I've been kidnapped. You need to send my money directly to me. Oh no, they're torturing me," and they stress you up enough that you don't think very carefully and send over the money. And this, unfortunately, is getting easier and easier, because it doesn't take that much long of a voice recording to make a fake version of my voice. So presumably this lecture has already given you enough material to make fake Anders quite well. So obviously we should all be rather careful when we suddenly get calls from our family members when they need money, and make sure that they have some secret keywords or something only they know, to tell us that actually I do need that money right now for secret reasons. It's also slightly disturbing to note that banks actually have started using voice prints for access. But again, ethically, this is not very problematic. I think what the big fear is that we quite often bring up is that we might end up in a world of post-truth, that we can't discern what's actually going on, because there is fake news all around. There is fake news that crowds out the actual news, and this is bad not just for ordinary citizens, but also for governments. If a government doesn't know what's going on, it's not going to make the right decisions. And you can certainly imagine really releasing the right clip at the right moment to maybe pour gasoline on political fires, or doing it at the right moment, like what happened relatively recently in Slovakia, where just before an election there was a viral clip about one of the candidates talking about manipulating the election. He lost, and a much more pro-Putin candidate won. It's unclear how much that clip affected things, but it's not implausible that it mattered. It might also be extra easy for minorities and women to be harassed in this way. That's bad, but it's not the kind of breakdown of consensus reality. The real issue here, I think, is that I think it's somewhat overblown, because we don't need fancy fake news to be confused about reality. Indeed, a lot of fake news is admittedly low budget. So instead of doing a really elaborate fakery, you just make up false information and put it together. Like that false message that Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. You just put up two pictures next to each other and then just lie. You don't need any fake picture of them shaking hands. Maybe that would make the article a little bit better. But it doesn't matter very much, because most of the people who want to be fooled, and they are the target, they are very willing to be fooled and fall for it. Actually convincing somebody who got an opposing view about this is very, very hard. And there is a long, long history of fake news. Everything from newspapers reporting that aliens have been discovered on the moon, over to the famous Orson Welles War of the World broadcast that didn't fool that many people, but still then later people have been assuming caused a mass panic and believed it did cause a mass panic. So we generate our own fake news. Similarly, you have malicious editing of video, which is quite often harder to detect than deepfakes. So it seems like the real problem here is confusion. You could argue that a democracy really needs to have common knowledge. Common knowledge is this philosophical concept that I know, that you know, that I know, and that we all know certain things. We all know who is the current prime minister. We know how he got into power and why, and we know how that might change in the system. If we are getting confused about who's prime minister, how he got there, and who's ordered to follow, democracy doesn't work very well. This is great news for authoritarian governments, because they just work because goons will come and beat you up if you don't do as you're told. They are afraid of something else, that citizens can communicate freely and build up their own common knowledge, including the realization that, hey, none of us likes the president. Actually, maybe we should just get rid of him. That is very dangerous for the authoritarian ruler, if people actually can form knowledge on their own without control. It's also interesting that deepfakes allow people to claim that true things are fake. So the first case was actually João Doria, who was at the time governor of Sao Paulo. And in 2018, he claimed that a video allegedly showing him at an orgy was a deepfake. And nobody has been able to prove that it wasn't. But realistically, 2018 is really early. It's really, back then, it would have been very technically hard to do it. And the amount of effort it would have gone into messing with the candidacy of a mayor of even a big city, it's probably not worth it. Today, of course, amateurs can do the same thing. So today, if you see a video of me doing something bad, I might claim it's a deep fake, and it might very well be, but it's much harder to tell what's going on. So the amount of effort it takes to do a good deep fake, that used to be a good indicator. But generally, computer evidence is surprisingly bad in many cases. Screenshots are regularly used, even though you can edit them. So in many ways, the world is kind of saved by being dumb but straightforward. Also, some people are going saying, oh, we can use deepfake detector to fix this, but they have quite a lot of false positives. So this is not a deepfake video, trust me on that. But if you ran it through a deepfake detector, it might very well say that this looks fake. Those reflections in the glasses are not quite right or something. But they would just be wrong. It's just a statistical thing. And this works extra badly if you happen to have a wrong skin color that we're not trained very well on. So the statistical power is good for the kind of people and scenery that you train the system on. But if you use it on somebody who's different or in a different situation, it's much less reliable. This is also a big problem for students that are quite often being called out now for having their essays being written by large language models. And quite often that's not true. It's just that there's some probability that the detector does it wrong. But unfortunately, a lot of teachers and universities don't quite understand that, up until the student usually responds by applying that detector to the PhD dissertations of a dean of a university and shows that, look, this must have been deepfaked back in the 1960s, which usually is what gets them off the hook. But again, this is more practical stuff. The real ethical issue is probably not so much about the truth, or rather it's about the truth of people. So when you think about deepfakes, a lot of it is about faces, the identity, and our control over our own appearance. And so that famous photo by Alberto Corda of Che Guevara, for example, has been used and reused endlessly. and poor Corda didn't get paid for it. So people have been turning it into things like that Andy Warhol style artwork. And again, Andy Warhol didn't get anything from that. People just copied his style, which incidentally by current copyright law is totally fine because you can't copyright a style. That might get interesting in the near future because of other generative AI that makes it very easy to copy everybody's style. And of course, that T-shirt that you can buy online, which is kind of hilarious because I guess both Corda and Che Guevara would not have approved at all on that T-shirt and its message. So generally, how would you react if somebody made a dirty video with your face on? Well, maybe some of us would be flattered. Many would probably be disgusted, and some of us would be horrified. And there seem to be several parts here. So one is the social aspect. How many other people would see this and how would react? One is also, what about the other party? Is it okay for them to do that? And is there something I might lose if my face ends up somewhere else? So when we think about actors, for example, they care quite a lot about their appearance because that's how we make the money. Indeed, you can even insure your appearance famously. And there is this right of publicity and personality rights where people actually have a right to control the commercial use of their identity. This is, I know the American law for this, but you get counterparts in most legal systems. So here, your appearance is treated as a kind of property, which indeed why descendants of famous actors can keep on making money from them, which is another interesting ethical issue. And it's interesting because this is a commercial right. It has very little to do with an ethical right, but most people would say, yeah, if you actually if my descendants use my faith for things I don't approve of, they're doing something that's not moral. But it is interesting because you could, at least in New York, it seems like a bankrupt celebrity might have to sell their appearance to creditors. But this is obviously a complicated case. And in German law, for example, yeah, you can't separate your appearance from who you are. But of course, fakes are in some sense stealing that separation. You're getting something here. So the really interesting part here is, of course, that you have a depiction that in some sense changes your identity or appropriates your likeness. And why is that important? So reputations is one thing. So I can say that, okay, that fake video call was false. But if you were seeing that video call, you might not be able to unsee it. If that fake porn video, if you've seen it, you might have been disgusted by it. And that disgust doesn't go away because disgust is a very low-level emotion. When you feel it, it attaches to certain objects, and then it's very hard to get rid of, even if you intellectually know that this is not how we work. So you might be able to create emotional links here between a face and an emotion of disgust. And this is, of course, what is really so nasty about doing deep fake porn of people and using against candidates, adding that suspicion that that candidate is, okay, I'm intellectual, I know maybe he didn't fake the election, but I've been kind of reminded of the faked elections and that candidate, and that might be hard to remove emotionally. So the worst kind of smears actually work because our emotional architecture is really bad at ignoring things that intellectually we think we should ignore. And this is also why our facial identity is so important. Our brains are kind of wired to think at faces as persons. We see a circle with two dots as a face. We see faces in clouds and toast. We see dolls as people. If somebody is handling a doll badly, we think less of them as a person, even though it's still an inanimate object. And that, of course, means that we identify people with their faces, which is incidental also why disfigurement and lookism is such a deep problem. If somebody looks really disturbing, even though they might be a totally fine person and they have total human dignity, we get a disquiet that makes it slightly harder to express that. And this, I think, is close to the core of why deepfakes are problematic. That caricature photo of Trump I have on the right is nasty, not because it's realistic in any way, but the political opponents that made it and use it are kind of using it to establish a link now between disquiet and Trump. And indeed, I'm having this moral quandary right now. Should I even be showing this? Because I'm even now having this in this lecture. So we have a whole system here of who we are and our relationship and how we relate that can be thrown into this array. And of course, these days it's getting more and more complicated because we're also complicated sets of identities. Right now, I'm in a lecturing mode identity. I'm a slightly different person when I'm talking role-playing games with my friends. I'm a third person in the pub. I might be a different person when I'm answering physics questions on an online site. And some of these identities are linked to my legal identity. Some of them are linked to my academic identity. Some are different emotional identities. And this is generally how we function in real life. We have different masks and personas, and we need to be able to deftly move between them. The problem is, of course, that they get tangled into each other. Our social media are making it harder maybe to keep entirely separate social identities, which is not a good thing always. Sometimes you want to ensure that who you're talking to is the person they're supposed to be. Like when it's your boss ordering you to move $25 million. Sometimes you want to have the right kind of knowledge that I don't know who he is, but I know he's honest about it. So we want to figure out better norms. And this, of course, gets even deeper when it's strongly emotional stuff like sex and sensuality. So that disturbing nonsense picture is what you get if you don't train your deep neural networks to generate things in a particular human way. These days, they can totally make totally adequate pornography. More interestingly, I can imagine that if I put my partner's face on somebody else's body in a pornographic picture, what's going wrong there? If I'm okay and my partner okay, is there any problem for the original person whose body got used? And this actually gets to some of the big issues showing up with generative AI, because they have been trained on all the pictures you can find online. And that's a lot of pornography by hardworking actors. They might honestly say, we're losing income on this. Just like the artist might say, hey, you use my paintings to train that thing, and now it's working my style. I might lose income, and I might have lost also some rights over my style. So there is an interesting issue here. It's a really weird thing if I were to use a picture from revenge porn, but change that into my partner. Then I'm hiding the person who presumably don't want their face to show up in this picture. But I have a feeling they would still not be all right, because it's just coming from a too tainted corner here. I think in general, we tend to say that information that is disgusting, gotten about in the wrong way, etc., is problematic, and we should actually not be using it. You can use different ethical frameworks. The Kantians would say, oh, we should not use other people as tools for our gratification. They have some Kantians have real problems with sex in general, but many of them are also kind of anti-pornography for this reason. But there might also be a deeper thing, that actually disassembling each other into voices, faces, motions is wrong, because we should be treating each other as an integrated whole that we can respect. But again, there is this weird thing about, well, what about imagery that doesn't represent any particular person? After all, fictional characters like Zeus and Batman have integrated personalities. It makes total sense to ask what Zeus would like to do in a certain situation. And if you ask different people, they would agree. But the interesting thing here is that then we can lend faces and actions to them by drawing them or talking about them. So even fictional characters might have identities. So I recently came across a rather nice paper that actually put these intuitions in a nice form. Adrienne de Ruyter argued that there are kind of three wrongs going on here. She doesn't say that deepfakes are immoral, just that they're morally suspect. They easily lend themselves to bad uses. And the first aspect is, of course, well, would the deepfake person object to the way they're represented? The second one is whether this deceives the viewers, and the third is the intent behind the deepfake. And I think this is a useful way of looking back. So the problem here is really that we might be misrepresenting people. So the Einstein picture I have to the right here would probably not be objectionable to Albert Einstein. He would probably say, yeah, that's a decent photo of me. Maybe he wanted a slightly different style. It's representative. It's really unlikely to deceive us because we all know that Einstein died before laptops were possible, and it was made for educational purposes. He might actually object way more to that first picture where Einstein is shaking hand with Putin. That one is a bit more problematic. Now, this, I think, is a useful guideline, and it also suggests that sometimes deepfakes can actually be good. So one interesting example is a documentary, Welcome to Chechnya. So this is a documentary about the plight of LGBTQ people in Chechnya. So they are fleeing the country because they're being literally killed there. And the problem is, in a normal documentary, you would pixelate the faces and distort the voices as they tell about the harrowing experiences. But that removes their identity, which is good for protecting them, but also very bad for getting the viewer to empathize with them. If we see a cloud of pixels and a distorted voice growling at us, is that a person with real feelings? Is that somebody we should feel compassion for? It gets harder because we've hidden them. So what they did was actually use deepfakes to give them fake voices and fake faces. And this doesn't depersonalize them. So in many ways, I think this is a beautiful example how you can actually hide information in a way that's not even fake. We would not normally recognize these people anyway. Their normal appearance doesn't matter to us. We care about them as people, and we can reveal them much more as people this way. And there are suggestions that this might be useful. I have a friend who's been working on in employment interviews. Given that gender and racial characteristics might be affecting the viewers, maybe you could hide that. So you use deepfakes to make people's voice and appearance neutral. Whether this is a good idea and actually works remains to be seen. I'm somewhat skeptical myself. I think there are many characteristics that are very hard to hide. But it might be a way of getting over lookism. It might be a way of getting over some kind of simple racial effects. Because a lot of racism is not about complex beliefs about other people. It's about gut feelings where people have been trained to fear the other. And if you reduce that, then you might actually reduce the racist effect. People have also, of course, been thinking about taking old photos and animating them. And there is, again, an idea about making chatbots based on loved ones. I noticed that in this series, there's going to be a discussion about the ethics of grief bots on July 17 by Christina Voinea. So that's going to go deeper into it. And again, we might apply these principles and think about would the person that we reconstruct approve of this use? So and that might vary quite a lot depending on who they are. Nobody asked the animated characters on this particular slide there, but I have a feeling that at least to the left, the American philosopher would probably have been amused by it. And in many cases, this is too small to be a problem. People might say, wait a minute, isn't this a problem that now we're starting to change the past? But to some extent, we've always done that. There are some changes of the past that are so inaccurate and problematic that we respond to them. A while ago, Google's generative AI got into trouble because they tried to make it more diverse and inclusive. So if you asked it to make a bunch of Vikings or members of a Nazi German cabinet in the 1930s, it added racial diversity to it, which was both hilarious and deeply wrong. You want AI systems that can understand what's right and wrong, but that's another can of worms. That's an enormous one I'm not going to open here. But we have this interesting situation where we're constantly reinterpreting the past, and we are constantly actually changing our view on what it was like. So I think this manipulation is not necessarily super problematic. I don't have the time to get into the other issues. I already mentioned some of the issues about generating likenesses and endless forms of imagery. We have a problem about not just deepfake people, but deepfake recipes and a lot of other information that becomes so cheap and easy to generate. But I want to end on this idea that right now we're probably panicking a bit too much about deepfakes because we mostly panic about any new technology. And I think the really valuable issue about the disquiet we feel about deepfakes is that we can use them as a lens or a prism to see what we really care about. They split apart, so to say, different aspects of identity, of faces, of emotions, of reputations, and make it possible to reflect on what we care about here. It also suggests that we probably need to reflect much more and go a bit less on our gut feelings when seeing something, whether online or even in the real life. That has always been a piece of good advice, but now I think it's becoming more and more urgent. Just because somebody that sounds like your relative tells you to do something, you might want to check that this actually fits. Why are they asking it? If you're a political candidate calls you up and claims something, maybe you should ask them some questions. Another important problem is we are fallible and we should expect to fail more in the future. And I think there is an interesting problem here of constructing a society that's resilient enough that even though people are lying all the time, confused a lot of the time, and manipulating all over the place, we can still make something that is robust. I don't think technology really deeply changes that. But I think it's a good starting point to use the technology to recognize how fallible we are and then try to realize that, okay, the truth, we might be bad at getting at that, but we might at least agree that we might want to move in that direction together, keeping an eye on each other and trying to figure out who of us in this group are the fake people. Well, thanks for listening, and I'm hoping that you have some questions for me. Thank you.